We are back for chapter 3, Good Girls versus Bad Girls. She starts off with a quote. It was 1959, and I was living in a dormitory at the University of Toledo. I'm working 2 or 3 part-time jobs to work my way through school. I was dating this guy who was a couple of years older, who was an engineering student, and I cared about him very much. I don't think in those days we knew about birth control. I didn't know anything. It was something good girls didn't talk about. I never talked about sex with anyone, including my family. I didn't know about ovulation or anything. Good girls didn't talk about those things. Carol 1. If you are a woman over 50 who had sex before marriage, you are one of the so-called bad girls. I would put myself squarely in that category. The only difference between me and the women whose stories appear here is that I didn't get caught. These women and I were certainly not alone in our badness. As early as the 1950s, about 39% of unmarried girls had gone all the way before they were 20 years old, and by 1973, the percentage had risen to 68%. Because of the difficulty of getting contraceptives, the frequency of premarital pregnancies rose right along with the number. In the mid-1950s, over 50% of first births to girls aged 15 to 19 were conceived out of wedlock. Therefore, the numbers rose sharply. By 1971 to 1974, the number of first births conceived outside of marriage to teenage girls had reached 60%. In post-World War II years, young people's attitudes towards premarital sex, as well as their actual sexual behavior, began to change. A revolution in dating behavior had actually begun back in the 1920s, as teens rather than their parents, started regulating dating behavior. Unlike their Victorian predecessors who courted on the front porch where their behavior could be closely monitored, the young people in the 1920s enjoyed a degree of privacy and mobility. As dating moved off the porch and into the community, parents were no longer present to set limits. Teens themselves began to determine what was appropriate sexual behavior and to enforce their own standards through peer pressure. All right, so I'm going to pause there. So a lot of that's still happening today in 2023, and, with everything happening politically around our country, in the United States at least, and I'm not saying that other countries aren't dealing with stigma, we don't have enough or good enough sex education. And it's actually been proven that when you have a good, comprehensive sex education, that the birth rates for young teens goes down. It's also been proven that with abortion access, contraceptive access, and as well as I'm losing my brain today. I cannot think, what is the word, with the availability with support, with SNAP benefits and all that stuff to help you, that the rate of adoption, so aka there's family preservation happening, it's important. Now, look, I'm going to have my personal views, I get it, but statistically, it's proven that the rate of teen pregnancies and the rate of abortion actually goes down when Democrats are in office because of those benefits, those resources and that support. Now, that's not to say that, if you have your personal views, I get it. I'm just saying with the support, it's needed, right? We can't just be like, oh, you can't just do this. We got to give information. And we got to destigmatize a lot of different aspects of it. Anyway, moving on. At the same time, they were being influenced by notions of love and romance, disseminated through movies, magazines, and popular music rather than by local customs. In 1924, for example, when the sociologists Robert and Helen Lind conducted extensive interviews with the residents of Muncie, Indiana, the young people were already having petting parties, going to the movies on their own, and parking. As more and more families owned cars, they afforded young people increasing independence and provided the privacy that allowed them to engage in sexual activity. Henry Ford, it seems, may have been at least partly to blame for the sexual revolution. Over the decades, cars have, of course, continued to play a significant role in dating life. And that was certainly true in the post-war years. Not only were they safe havens, they also served, as they continue to, as a measure of a young man's status. We were middle-class folks. I had a pretty normal childhood. I was in my senior year of high school, still kind of quiet and shy, not one of the popular cheerleader girls. But I had my own little clique of friends. And there was a guy who had moved to town that all the girls just thought was so cute and so cool. And we talked and whispered. Weren't his blue eyes so pretty? And all this kind of stuff. He drove a really hot car, which was real important at the time. I think it was a pumped up super sport Chevelle, aka Chevy. Big tires, big engine, souped up, beautiful, fast, noisy, because noisy was important, with a stick shift, which is also very important. And for some reason, he decided to ask me out. It wasn't my first date or anything. It wasn't even my first sexual experience. But he was very cool. And I was cool because I was going out with him. Barbara. The economic boom that followed World War II increased young people's independence from their parents and escalated the revolution in sexual behavior. An increasing number of non-married co-eds left home to attend college and joined the nearly 6 million returning veterans whose education was funded by the GI Bill. The younger generation became a cultural force to be reckoned with, and much of the new energy seemed to be sexual. As early as 1952, panty raids were being conducted on campuses all across the country. Gangs of nice college boys were breaking windows and entering women's dorms just to get hold of girls' underpants. Moreover, expressions of sexuality not only became common among single people in their 20s, but trickled down into the high school age youth culture as well. Young people took their cues from the older teens and mass media, definitely not from their parents. For girls, magazines like 17 were looked to as the fronts of wisdom about what was popular and sexy. Increasing one's sex appeal, of course, required a whole host of products that mothers thought their girls were too young to buy or wear. I remember the many battles over skirt length, lipstick, and blush, which my mother insisted on calling Rogue. That raged routinely in my house, and I'm sure in households across America. The first floor girls' restroom in my high school was packed every morning with young women rolling their waistbands of their skirts so as to rise their hemline to the maximum distance above the knee permitted by school law. A considerable amount of elbowing was required to make it up to the mirror and apply makeup, which was prominently removed after 7th period. Interestingly, a young people expanded the boundaries of permissible sexual activity. A movement towards forming steady relationships took hold. Sociologists in the early 50s noted a significant new trend among young people to get into serious relationships rather than date around, which had been more popular in previous decades. This new emphasis on commitment might well have been due to the fact that it provided something of safety net for preserving a girl's reputation, as more and more young people engaged in sexual intercourse. During the post-war decades, the question that the youth grappled with became not so much if as when premarital sex was considered permissible. Permissible by their peers, that is, because sexual activity was still not discussed or even acknowledged by most parents. Pausing there, it depends. Even today, a lot of parents don't talk about it, and it's typically in extremely religious homes. I can tell you from my personal experience, we did have a lot of talks. That being said, my parents are not religious at all. My dad is Catholic and my mom is Jewish, but they're not practicing other than like the holidays in the house. But I think they also are very open and recognizable to what is happening in the world. And considering they were children of this time or teens in this time that we're talking about, I think they know more than, a lot of younger parents or like super religious parents, because they I feel like a lot of parents want to preserve the innocence, and I get it, being a parent myself, but we also have to have these talks with our kids, age appropriate, of course, that protect them from getting into harmful situations. So yeah, unfortunately it still happens. Maybe not nearly as much, but it still happens, especially in the religious communities. All right, moving on. And though the rules about who could have sex without risking reputational suicide surely varied from group to group, town to town, and region to region, they followed a general progression over the years. At first, sex was permissible only for couples who were engaged, later for those who were pinned or going steady, then for those in love, and finally widening all the way to include those who were simply attracted to one another. If you got pregnant outside of marriage, you were considered a whore, a slut, or whatever. You had no morals, therefore you deserve this. But if you didn't get caught, you were smart. When you got a fraternity pin on your breast, that meant you were allowed to have sex. That meant you were engaged to be engaged or whatever. I never understood all that, but that's the way it was. Nancy 3. In the early 50s, many women engaged in heavy petting but refrained from sexual intercourse until a promise of marriage was forthcoming, and the majority waited until their wedding night. But as the years progressed, not only did more young couples begin having sex before marriage, but they had it at younger and younger ages. Comparing white unmarried women who turned 18 between 1956 and 1958 with those who did so between 1971 and 1973, the percentage who had their first premarital sexual intercourse at age 15 quadrupled from 1.3% to 5.6%. Those in the same cohort who had premarital sex before age 20 jumped from 33% to 65%. And though eventually a commitment was no longer required, what sexual intercourse signified in a relationship often varied quite a bit among partners. Plenty of young women and some young men presumed sex would solidify a commitment, where one was never intended. In some cases, young women who did not feel ready to have sex did so anyway because of continual pressure from a boyfriend and the lack of assertiveness required to put a stop to the steady progression of sexual advances. More recent studies have shown that sexual coercion from partners still plays a powerful role in the timing of a young woman's sexual debut. In a survey from the 1990s, 25% of women indicated that they did not want to have sex the first time they did so. Sometimes sexual aggressiveness went beyond coercion and women were date raped through neither the concept nor the terminology was well understood or defined at the time. About 7% of the women I interviewed became pregnant as a result of rape, not by the violent sex criminals who have been the staple of television dramas, aka Law and Order SVU, but by nice young men. An emphasis on nice, by the way, in this book, but it's true. All right. It was in about February, and a friend's brother was home on break from his school and called me up and said, "All my friends are having this party at the summer house that we're opening up. I don't have anybody to go with. Would you go with me?" I said, "Sure, I'll go." And we went off to the party, and I really remember very little about that night. I remember standing in a kitchen talking to this fellow about calculus and all these Latin things, and somebody handed me a drink. And the next thing I know, everything was spinning. I felt desperately sick, and I said, "I'm going to get sick. I have to go lie down." I remember walking and trying to find some place to lie down. That was the last of my memory. The next morning, I thought, oh my God, what has gone on? I was still feeling out of it, that I wasn't really quite sure, but I started to suspect what may have happened. Back then, date rape was not a term, but apparently that's what it was. So I don't know the birth father at all. I have no visual memory of him. My reaction was, I don't ever want to think about this again. Whatever happened, happened. I don't want any part of this. When I went home for Easter break, I started feeling really sick, and I thought, oh gosh, I have the flu. Well, then it didn't go away. I thought, could I have become pregnant? 2 months later, I thought, this is not right. I went to the library and I started reading all these books about pregnancy to try to figure it out. I had no idea what the symptoms were. I don't know when I really figured it out, but I knew I absolutely could not tell anybody because I would be expelled from college. It was just automatic expulsion, no questions asked. And I was halfway through my senior year, and I knew I had to hide it in order to get out of school. I was so devastated that this happened to me because it was the antithesis of everything I was and how I was brought up. It really just shattered every sense of self I had. And I went into denial. By denying it, I could be who I really was and not what I had become, or at least what I thought I had become. Carol, too. So, unfortunately, still happening with the date rape. They're making it easier and easier, unfortunately. Now, do a lot of colleges kick out young women for being pregnant? Not unless it's a religious college. So that is the good part, in a sense. You can be pregnant in college and it's okay. You can be a single parent and be in college. Heck, I was. There's a lot more support unless it's a religious, and I mean a Christian specifically, college, at least here in America. Now, I can't speak to other countries. I'm talking here in America, right? All right, moving on. One might expect that with premarital intercourse becoming more frequent among the youth, a loosening of the stigma associated with engaging in sex would have followed. But one of the great ironies of this time period was that the social policing of youth by their peers was intense. and could be psychologically brutal. The girls bore the brunt of this social condemnation as the sexual revolution evolved. For young men, being known as sexually active was a badge of honor among their peers, whereas for young women, sexual activity had to be kept a secret. And if word got out, their reputations could be devastated. Still happening in 2023, though not nearly as bad when you're older. It's still happening. It's like men or boys or, the gender of male is seen as acceptable and can get away with anything. But when you're a female, it's like everything is your fault, right? Anyway. Throughout the 50s and 60s, women had to be highly discreet about their sexual behavior. A reputation was almost impossible to regain. An unattached girl thought to be putting out was a threat to the social order of the peer community. More specifically, she was a threat to other young women who were following the rules and feared losing their boyfriends to someone more sexually adventuresome. There was this business that the girls are only two types. You were either a Madonna or a whore. And not the singer Madonna, the Virgin Madonna. You were good or bad. Between the culture of the family and the culture of the religion, you were very bad if you had sex. So if you couldn't really plan to have it. It just happened. We had been petting and you get all the, we have to go further. We have to go further. I said, I don't want to get pregnant. Don't get me pregnant. He said, don't worry, I won't. Diane 4. In my Midwest high school, even in the late 1960s, women did not admit having sexual intercourse even to their closest friends. There was very little to talk about sex apart from the boys' locker room talk, which often stretched the truth but could make or break a girl's reputation. Being well-liked and popular among females and male friends and being sexually active behind closed doors required a set of advanced social skills. There were very definite and complicated rules about what was and was not permissible and under what conditions. Careful calculations had to be made about the number of dates and the number of bases that a boy was allowed to reach. The sum of these calculations had to be weighed against the seriousness of the commitment and how others perceived the relationship. Going steady was a pinnacle of commitment in my school and held a kind of false promise of a future together. It was, for all intents and purposes, a practice engagement. Often, young people practiced quite a bit and had one steady after another, ostensibly in search of the ideal mate. Once a young woman was going steady, she removed herself from the competitive dating scene, and her sexual behavior fell off her classmates' radar screen. Having sex with a steady did not presume a promise of eternal bliss, but at least a young woman had sex with her steady. She would not be labeled promiscuous. Everyone silently agreed on a don't ask, don't tell policy when it came to the activities of a committed couples. If a young woman had not gotten to the going steady stage before having sex, her reputation was more vulnerable. There were always a few young women who were either unfamiliar with the rules, unfairly targeted, or more sexually adventurous, all of whom were labeled as sluts. Those of us who escaped being targeted of rumors did not, to our shame, befriend those girls, because we were feared guilt by association. After all, our status was tenuous and could be preserved only by keeping our distance and maintaining our hypocritical stance through steadfast denial. The deep and damaging irony of the bad girl myth is that those who became pregnant were assumed to be less moral, to be transgressors by others who were engaging in the very same behavior. A young woman's pregnancy was thought to be the result from her badness. The scorn and blame heaped on these women seemed to have been partly a mechanism of denial, by focusing attention on women whose sexual behavior was evident. Others could continue to deny their own. Pausing, still happening today that, I feel like we've talked about this in other chapters, where if you become pregnant as if you're single, or it's not nearly as bad if you're in a relationship, but, depending on what religion you're in, it will be looked down upon. But women still get the blame, right? Not really men. And a woman can only carry one full-term pregnancy a year, if that, right? And I say if that because not all pregnancies, go full term. However, men can get multiple women pregnant in a day, 365 days a year, if they so choose. But yet the stigma on women is where the problem is. That's why they did Roe versus Wade, or technically overturned it at this point. It's disgusting. Women are constantly being targeted in society, and they're trying to control our bodies, not just with, laws, but with the stigma and the peer pressure. It's really just gross. All right, continue on with our reading. You were shunned if you were pregnant. That's the way they reacted to girls who were pregnant in high school. The girls who didn't get pregnant were all virgins. We swore up and down we were virgins. If you fooled around, nobody else knew about it. It was never a thing where you could say to a friend of yours that you went to bed with somebody. That was just taboo. You were all supposed to be virgins, and the ones that got pregnant, it was like, oh, she was no good. She was promiscuous. Guys were supposed to be that way. They have their oats to sow. So that's the way it was. Girls weren't supposed to do it, and guys were always trying to do it with them. Carol 1. There were good girls and there were bad girls. I played a good girl, but I was really a bad girl. A lot of people didn't know that I was sexually active. There was such shame associated with being pregnant and unmarried at the time. When I was in high school, there was a girl who became pregnant. She had PE with us, and then she was gone. I remember being in the locker room, and the girls were snickering and making jokes. She was such a nice person, a good athlete, and they turned their back on her. They could have at least said, "It's okay, we still like you." Joyce 1. I was a sorority girl, and I was going into my junior year at the University of Minnesota. I conceived on September 20th, 1968 in the Gopher Motel. I was from a small town, so I didn't tell anybody, because in 1968, you were considered trash if you were pregnant. The symbol of being good, white, middle-class family was Lily White daughter, Sue. The other fateful irony about the explosion of premarital sex in the post-war years was that society at large failed to acknowledge the magnitude of change underway and failed to act responsibly to educate the youth about pregnancy and prevention. Young people were clearly secretive about their behavior, but by the 1960s, so many pregnancies were occurring that the warning signs should have been clear and troubling enough to sound an alarm. Instead, adult society effectively turned a blind eye to the situation, and in the main simply continued to profess that young people should hold out until marriage. Women were expected to wait and learn about sex from their husbands, who would bring their sexual experience to the marriage. I never quite figured out how that was supposed to be mathematically possible, but presumably the theory was that the future husbands gained their experience with a few bad girls who were not marriage material and who were having sex with the majority of the male population. Most parents simply did not want to acknowledge that their sons and daughters were having sex. Not my son, not my daughter. But with the millions of young people having sex with no planning and no protection, there was a high likelihood that parents' denial would be short-lived. School systems had not yet begun offering substantial sex education, and incredibly, in the late 1960s, were still referring to sexual intercourse as the Marriage Act. Sex education generally consisted of watching scratchy movie that showed egg and sperm meeting. Wherever this mysterious meeting place was, it seemed to have nothing to do with being in the backseat of a car with your boyfriend. Many of the women I interviewed were utterly uninformed about sex and pregnancy, and I learned what little they knew from their boyfriends. I can remember in 6th grade we had a film. You know, the sperm and the egg and the whole thing. There was no sex education. My mom sent away for the Kotex kit in the mail, and it came, and there were all different kinds of shapes, sizes and shapes of pads. Of course, this was before tampons. She didn't really talk to me, but the sort of supplied the information. That was probably the best she could do. I remember there was a controversy about should we have sex education in high school at the time. I don't think we ever had any, and condoms weren't as available to kids as they are now. We were oblivious. I mean, certainly I knew that if you had sex, you could get pregnant. I wasn't that naive, but abstinence wasn't thought of. You were just horny teenagers, and that was it. Becky. If there was any talk of sex in the home, it was usually sex talk the girls had with their mother around their first period, and mainly concerned itself with wearing of Kotex pads and the stretchy belts that kept them in place. I think I was in 5th or 6th grade, and I went to the bathroom, and I'm pulling my panties down, and they had blood on them. And I started screaming because I didn't know what was happening. They called my mother, and she came and picked me up from school. We stopped by the drugstore, and she left me in the car and went in and handed me a bag and told me to go in the bathroom and put it on. I sat in the bathroom probably an hour trying to figure out how all this mess worked. There was a stretchy thing with clamps on it, and then these pads scared me to death. Joyce 1. When parents did talk to their daughters about sex, they often began the sentence with the word don't. Don't ever let a boy touch you. Or if pregnancy was even acknowledged as something that could occur before marriage, don't ever come home pregnant. This directive rarely included an explanation of how one might actually get or not get pregnant. Since most adolescents are eager to grow up as quickly as possible, the silence and mystery surrounding sex surely only made it all the more intriguing. My mother talked about sex. Oh God, please. You can't be kissing boys. You can't be letting anyone touch you. Sex is dirty. Sex is bad. It was always bad things. Always taboo. It was never healthy. Never a healthy talk. My mother was 24 and 4 kids. Probably that's why sex was bad. We did not have sex education in school. I mean, I graduated high school in 1964, and sex was not discussed. You were not supposed to have sex until you were married, and that was it. My goodness, you didn't talk about sex. It was all negative. It only got you in trouble. She was right about that, though. When you think about it, she was right. I should have listened to her. Caroline 1. I was throwing up, and one of my friends said, "You're probably pregnant." And I said, "Oh, no, 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 no. You can't be pregnant unless you're married." That's what my parents told me. You have to be married to have a baby. So I couldn't be pregnant because I wasn't married. Sex education was in 6th grade. All the campfire girls went and saw this film. I didn't understand it. I mean, it was just the man has the sperm and the woman has the egg. And somehow or another, they make a baby. They didn't talk about body parts. Ever. Oh gosh, no. Men and women back in the day slept in separate beds on television. I'm adopted, and my parents were older. They were scared to death to talk about sex, scared to death to talk about anything, Nancy too. Sex was just not discussed in those days. You found out from your friends. The girls would talk at pajama parties or if they got together at somebody's house after school. But sex talked in school? Oh my God, no. I remember when Peyton Place was published, it was banned. So we all had a copy of Peyton Place. We would stick it inside a book in study hall and read it. If we ever got caught reading that book, I mean, you can't even imagine the detentions and the phone calls home. Life would not be worth living. And you did not discuss sex at home. I can see my mother sitting there knitting. My mother was a great knitter. She was like Madame Defarge in A Tale of Two Cities. She would knit, knit, knit to avoid conversation. I remember her knitting away, and all of a sudden I said to her, "What is sexual intercourse?" She looked at me right in the eye and said, "Don't bother me, I'm counting." Maureen too. The mother's denial of the reality that their daughters might need some facts about sex and pregnancy is especially illogical, given that statistically almost half of the mothers themselves had sex before marriage, and some had walked down the aisle pregnant. But then again, logic usually has little to do with sex. Parents usually don't think their child is having sex. That was likely not changed over time. Even for those who were somewhat aware of how to prevent pregnancy, effective contraceptives were hard to come by. The legacy of blame and shame that so many of the women who became pregnant have had to live with has had this perpetuated in part by a current lack of awareness about just how difficult contraceptives were to get a hold of in those post-war decades. This was particularly true of contraceptives for single women. Many of the laws in effect in the 1950s and 60s had been in place since the Victorian era. In 1873, the very first time in U.S. history, birth control was prohibited by law with the passage of the Comstock Law, which criminalized sending obscene matter through the mail. In the mid-1800s, women could send away for informational pamphlets and ads for douches to prevent pregnancy were common in women's magazines and newspapers, though they were often veiled in non-specific language having to do with cleansing or health. In fact, information about birth control methods had been passed down through generations of women long before devices were regulated through the medical establishment. Women were using sponges, down there, several thousand years before Christ. Whether through herbal potions, substitutories, diaphragms, or rhythm method or douching, women have tried to prevent unwanted pregnancy. But in 1872, Anthony Comstock, a religious reformer and the founder of the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice, drafted an anti-obscenity bill, which included a ban on contraceptives. He argued that contraceptive devices were obscene and sinful because they prevented contraception. Yeah, make it make sense, right? Comstock successfully campaigned for the enactment of the bill as a federal law, and he was instrumental in 24 states adopting their own versions of the Comstock Law, restricting the sale of contraceptives at the state level. Despite the diligence of birth control advocates like Margaret Sanger in the early 1900s, as late as the 1960s, some states still criminalized merely dispensing information about birth control and making contraceptive devices available for women. Unfortunately, we're getting back to that point. Even as laws changed state by state, the moralistic attitudes endured, and a few unmarried women were willing to attempt an appointment with a doctor to obtain contraceptives. I mean, the lack of information in 1966 was astounding if you wanted to get birth control pills. You had to be flashing a diamond solitaire. Doctors really didn't give them to you. Why would you need those? You shouldn't be having sex anyway. Nancy 3. During the late 1950s and through most of the 1960s, the most effective means of birth control, the pill and the in-uterine device, were either unavailable or inaccessible to single women. The pill was available for the regulation of menstrual periods beginning 1957 and was approved for contraceptive use by the FDA in 1960. The IUD also became available in the 1960s, but both the pill and the IUD posed safety concerns when they were initially released, and it was not until the early 1970s that both were generally considered to be safe. It was not the safety of contraceptives, however, that prevented doctors in the 1960s from prescribing the pill or the IUD to unmarried women, but state laws or personal moral laws. And this is exactly what's happening today when it comes to abortions. And I'm sure they're going to go with contraceptives before we know it, because they don't care about women, at least from what I've seen. Anyway, the diaphragm was the most device widely used by women in the 1950s, but it was largely unavailable to single women because a doctor's visit was required. Okay, I'd finished nursing school and I was working as a nurse. And one thing led to another and we had sex. That's what happens. Birth control just wasn't available. Condoms were available, but hardly ever used. The birth control pill was on the market, but in those days, you really had to be married to go to a doctor and ask. There weren't walk-in clinics. There wasn't any of that stuff. Birth control was not a subject that was talked about. If you know somebody who was not married and was taking oral contraceptives, they were taking them to regulate their period. I couldn't even tell you how many people had that story. Maureen, too. I knew I should be doing something to prevent pregnancy, but I would never have gone to a doctor. You had to pretend you were married to get birth control pills. I could never have done that. I'm not an actress. There was a girl in our dormitory who sold them. I don't know how she got them. I started taking them, but I felt terribly guilty because it went against what I had been taught. So I sort of took them, and then I didn't take them. And then I took them, and then I didn't take them. And I got pregnant. I just didn't really understand that you had to continuously take them. Maggie. The most readily available contraceptive for non-married couples was condoms, but they were often kept behind the counter at the pharmacy. And in some towns, just asking to purchase one might result in a phone call from the pharmacist to the boy's parents. Sometimes prophylactics were found in gas station vending machines, but for the number of reasons, including difficulty getting them or young men feeling confident that they knew how to prevent pregnancy without a condom, they were not often used by young people. I got pregnant at the end of July 1969. I remember I went to the drive-in movie to see Easy Rider because the birth father loved motorcycles. He was just home from Vietnam, and the first thing he did was buy a motorcycle. So we had to go see that movie. This was before the days of birth control. You had to be 18 or buy a rubber. They didn't have them in Stop and Shop like they have today. They were down at the corner drugstore. The boys would maybe buy them, sneak them, or something, but as a female to go and buy rubbers, oh my God, that did not happen. I probably should have said prophylactics, but you'll wipe that out. There's no way. They wouldn't have given them to you. And you think, oh, it's not going to happen to me. I'll never get pregnant. We had dated for about 2.5 months before I got pregnant. But that was the first time I ever had sex in the back seat of that car, watching Easy Rider. Kathy, too. In the state of Connecticut, home state of Anthony Comstock, still had a law in 1961 that prohibited counseling and medical treatment to married persons for the purposes of preventing contraception. The constitutionality of the constitutionality of that prohibition was struck down in 1965 when the Supreme Court decided the case of Griswold versus Connecticut. Estelle T. Griswold, the executive director of Planned Parenthood League in Connecticut, and Dr. H. Lee Buxton, a Yale professor and physician who served as medical director of the League, were arrested in 1961 for giving information and instruction to a married woman to help her prevent contraception. The Supreme Court's decision in Griswold versus Connecticut guaranteed all married couples in the country the right to receive information and services to prevent pregnancy based on the right of privacy in marital relations. By 1970, most women were either married or single. Whether married or single, were able to get prescriptions for the pill or other contraceptive devices and control their own pregnancy prevention. But in the state of Massachusetts, a law still prohibited the dispensation of any kind of birth control to an unmarried man or woman. In 1967, William Bard, longtime reproductive rights crusader, challenged the state's anti-contraceptives law, which also stipulated that only doctors or pharmacists could provide contraceptives by giving vaginal foam to a woman after a 1967 lecture on birth control at Boston University. Bard was not an authorized distributor of contraceptives, and he was promptly arrested, convicted of a felony, and spent 36 days in jail for crimes against chastity. Ridiculous. They don't care. Only when his case, Eisenstadt versus Bard, reached the Supreme Court and was decided in his favor in 1972, was access to birth control guaranteed to all single men and women in the United States. With little information or access to effective birth control until the early 1970s, most young people either took their chances or took ineffective precautions such as rhythm method and withdrawal, more commonly called pulling out. Still happens to this day. It's sad. Which required no access or planning. Boys were convinced that withdrawal was a surefire method, and most girls took their word for it. Interestingly, a survey conducted by Kinsey Institute in 1989 indicated that 1/4 of those surveyed still believed that the withdrawal was an effective method for contraception. I told you, there's so little information, and even today with contraceptives available, it's not 100%. And so people assume that because you can have access to condoms and the pill and the Plan B and all this stuff, that it's all 100%. It's not. You actually need 2 forms of contraceptives, and even then, it's still not 100%, which is why a lot of abortions happen through Planned Parenthood. The majority of them, actually. So when people want to get rid of abortion, they're highly misinformed that, they think that Planned Parenthood is just doing abortions left and right, and that, people aren't using contraceptions or contraceptives, but they are. And so it's extremely problematic with this whole thing and this misinformation. And again, we're in 2023 and this is still happening. And this information is not widely available. Or at least people are not making it widely available. So, moving on. In fact, withdrawal, the rhythm method, and vaginal foam are the least effective methods. We knew that, right? Anyway, he knew all about the rhythm method, so he asked me when I had my last period. That's why it was okay to have sex without any condom. What else was there in 1963? There wasn't anything. I guess there was the diaphragm, but who knew? I became paralyzed by the fact that I was pregnant. I was so unprepared for it. When I was in high school, I remember there were a couple of girls who got pregnant, and there was just all that negative gossip. That was not me. Wasn't part of that at all. Judith, 3. My mom hadn't been real big on telling me about sex. I think like most of girls my age, we kind of tried to figure it out on our own. I knew having sex could get me pregnant, but I didn't think it would get me pregnant. I didn't think I would get pregnant. I didn't know why, but that's what I thought, Barbara. I had no idea what I was going to do. I mean, abortions were not legal, and they're making that not legal again. The world wasn't going to accept a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant single mother in 1966. I knew I wasn't going to tell the father. There was another girl who was pinned to a guy in the same fraternity. When she got pregnant, he trotted out 3 or 4 of his fraternity brothers to say they all had sex with her. Nancy, 3. I was 23 years old at the time. I was not educated at all about sex. In Catholic school, they were constantly putting in your mind that you never had sex before marriage. You didn't need to know anything about it. The only time I heard anything about the reproductive system was when I was a senior in high school, and one of the nuns got up and tried to tell us about 2 frogs having sex. When I stop and think about it, I never even knew the parents slept in the same bed until I went to a girlfriend's house, and her mother and father did. I thought that was a mortal sin. Betty. Most of the women I interviewed had been wholly uninformed about sex and pregnancy prevention. Few reported that they or their partner had used protection. Many did not think that they could become pregnant after only a few sexual encounters. Some had boyfriends who used condoms on occasion, and others tried the rhythm method with only a vague notion of the days during which contraception was likely to occur. Stopping there. So you can get pregnant even when you're on your period, although it's slightly less likely because you're in your cycle. It's still possible, okay? So people assume that if you're in your ovulation period, that's the only time you can get pregnant. You have a higher chance, but you can get pregnant at any time. Let's be real about that. You can get pregnant at any time. All right. Some had boyfriends who used condoms on occasion, and others tried the rhythm method with only a vague notion of, we read that. They had been left to figure it out for themselves, and they were ultimately unsuccessful. Given sexual activity and inadequate precautions, there was a high likelihood that pregnancy would occur. A sexually active teenager who does not use contraceptives has a 90% chance of becoming pregnant within a year. Hearing these women tell their stories today, one cannot help but acknowledge the unfairness of calling them bad girls, and out of the social scorn that was inflicted almost exclusively on them, and not on the young men with whom they had conceived. I was a senior in college, and I was getting ready to begin my student teaching, which was very exciting. I'd been dating somebody for a few years, and he was the person I was going to marry. We had gone through the traditional steps of that time. First, it was the friendship ring. Everybody got the pearl ring. And then the Christmas right before, I was given a hope chest. It was a beautiful hope chest, and everybody was giving me gifts and planning for this marriage. Once I finished school, the next step would be the engagement, of course. I was thinking maybe the summer after graduation. He was a couple of years older than I, and he was teaching at the time. So, we had a relationship, and we had plans for the future. But the plan did not include my becoming pregnant at this point of time. And it was still going to be okay. We went out, we ordered wedding rings, we were having them engraved. I didn't believe those rings were ever picked up. I knew that my parents would be upset, but I didn't know how bad it would be. My mother was screaming and yelling, and my father threw him out of the house and then hit me so hard that I went across the kitchen. It was horrible. I just never expected that. Then we went to tell his family, and they were horrible too. They left me sitting there in his house with his mother screaming at me. And the last thing I remember was her saying to me was, "What have you done to my son? What about my son's life?" My parents said that if I agreed never to see him again and do exactly as they told me to do, everything would be taken care of. I remember calling him and telling him that, and he said that might be the best thing because we had too much going against us. Kathy. All right, that is the end of this part of chapter 3. Before we move on to personal stories, the next video will be Nancy's story, and then it will be, I think, Claudia, if I'm correct. Hold on, let me double check. Yeah, Claudia. So I will see you guys next time, which will be Friday. I am uploading Monday, Wednesday, and Friday for this book. So if you're checking in on those days while I'm reading, awesome. If you're here afterwards, welcome. And you can check out that next video. Sending you all love, and I will see you guys real soon.